if you can learn how to see sacredness everywhere, that everything can be a sacred text to you. Everything can be, if you have the eyes to see it and you've got the kind of the will to understand something as a text to you.
What's up?
How are you?
You know, the world's burning and here we are. We're back. It's the end of January while we're recording this. Let's talk about our new series we're going to be doing throughout the year on this podcast, which is our Sacred Text series.
Yeah.
This is one you brought up to me last year. We were talking about favorite movies and things and a way to kind of shake it up and share some more personal favorite movies as we do watch-alongs. And so our hope for everyone listening with this one is you get to know us a little bit better, but also we can kind of deep dive on some movies that we absolutely love and we can't stop watching or going back to. And then we'll have linked in the show notes where you can watch it and hopefully at least provide some different insights before you rewatch. And then maybe you'll get something different out of it. And you can let us know in our DMs or comments what you think of these movies. But Madison, let's kick us off. Talk to us about what sacred text means and why you refer to movies like this as a sacred text.
You know, we both went to BYU.
We did.
We both grew up in a community that had its own versions or its own sacred texts, and some of those were community sacred texts, like something like the Bible, and some of them are pretty niche, specific sacred texts to our communities. But while I was there in my my mid-20s or so, I read the Bhagavad Gita, which is one of the sacred texts for Hindus. And I loved it. It was a fantastic book, fantastic text. And in it, there was a line, a verse that really struck me in my really Mormon days. It says something like, just as a reservoir is useless in a flood, so is scripture useless to anyone who can see God in all things and in all places. And that verse in the Bhagavad Gita really blew apart my brain, was like, oh my gosh, wow. Because Mormons already kind of have this idea of an expanded set of scripture beyond just the Bible. And that verse in the Bhagavad Gita really helped me to understand that if you can learn how to see sacredness everywhere, that everything can be a sacred text to you. Everything can be, if you have the eyes to see it and you've got the kind of the will to understand something as a text to you. And so I started to watch movies or read books or whatever, things become sacred texts to me over time. And I think especially as we learn to read a text mythically and symbolically rather than just literally, because I'd say a literal interpretation of a text, whether it's a movie or whatever, is just this story is about what's on the screen. Star Wars is just about a space family with space wizards, right? To read something symbolically is to be oh no, well, there's the dark and then there's the light side, and these are symbols for other aspects of a story, and we can use them as symbols to understand ourselves and our world better. And then I'd say to read a text mythically is to read ourselves into the story. That's getting into archetypal work, with Carl Jung and stuff. That to read a text mythically is to say, who is Luke Skywalker inside of me? Who is Darth Vader inside of me? And how do both of these archetypes live inside of me? And I think that is a more mythical reading of text. And so as I relate to stories that are sacred texts to me, I relate to them on literal levels, symbolic levels, and mythic levels. And they're stories that I come back to over and over and over again, because they are mirrors that I've learned how to see myself in, and they are either have changed the way that I relate with the world or really deeply resonate with the ways that I already relate to the world, and serve as kind of a touchstone, as a sacred text. You might go back to the Bible, a Bible story over and over again. You go back to a certain story, movie story, book story, TV story over and over again because it resonates with something in your soul, rather than just ooh, cool, there's explosions, I like this.
Which is still a fun way to watch a movie, but yeah, different.
Oh yeah, no, of course, we all love popcorn movies, but I know as we go through this, we're going to be talking about movies that are sacred text to us. Families will have sacred text movies that as a family, they just watch these movies over and over again throughout time, on a yearly whatever. And there's just something in the story that resonates with members of the family. And so I would say to our listeners who are like listening to this, as we talk through our own, like mine and yours, sacred text movies, pay attention to what stories grab your attention, and just, like, don't let go, that you just seem to obsess, maybe a strong word, but just really fixate on, and just like really gravitate towards. What are those stories, and what are they trying to get you to understand about the world? What is your unconscious mind pulled to in these things?
And I want to make a distinction as we kick this off because I've already had this question a few times. But at least in my opinion, and I'll ask yours next, but in my opinion, these are not the best movies of all time. These are not all 10 out of 10 on IMDb or AFI Top 100. It's more personal, and sometimes a movie can be lower on a list of other people's rankings or whatever else or have its flaws. But like you're saying, if you internalize and mirror and put yourself into it, it creates more value than maybe it had on its own. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would, but I would also posit that my sacred texts are perfect movies.
No notes. No notes. Let's tease a couple because I think we can both talk about some of ours that we'll see this year just to kind of give people a little taste of it. I know for me, we're starting off this week with one that's kind of a weird entry for me called The Five People You Meet in Heaven, based on the book by Mitch Albom. But later in the year, we've got Sing Street, an absolute banger from 2016. We've got The Fountain in 2006, Chernobyl, Blazing Saddles, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, It's a Wonderful Life. So I'll kind of jump around, and that's some of the ones I've got written down. How about you?
I've got Princess Mononoke, which Lord of the Rings, Booksmart, Palm Springs, Interstellar, Spirited Away, Avatar: The Last Airbender, The Legend of Korra, Across the Spider-Verse, Steven Universe, Fleabag. I mean, I got a lot, dude. Walter Mitty, Community, Tree of Life, Barbie. I mean, all these movies are like sacred texts on some level.
We hope everyone will listen and, like you're saying, re-examine what movies are sacred text to you or your family, growing up or otherwise, and share with us. And hopefully down the road too, we'll have some people on to kind of talk about theirs, or maybe wrap up interviews with that. But with that said, let's kick off today. So today we're going into our own first sacred text of the year. Mine will be The Five People You Meet in Heaven, and yours is Terrence Malick's The Tree of Life. We'll kick off with mine first. I'm going to say this. Mine was already written down. Once you said Tree of Life, I was kind of like, oh, this is fun. Because in my mind, they're kind of brother sister in the goofiest of ways. Mine was a made for TV movie based on a book. And it's a simplistic way that, at least for me, took me out of some stricter Christian mindsets while still within the bounds of Christianity and opened my mind a little bit of, oh, here's a way in which humanity's connected. And then Tree of Life, on the other hand, is a very big jump. And so it's a nice little 1-2 punch. So watching them back to back for me, I did chuckle a little bit because I was like, it's almost like the difference between taking a sociology 100 or 200 course in undergrad and a PhD course in the way that it causes your brain to really work hard. I know in finishing up The Five People You Meet in Heaven, I think I've moved beyond those first lessons, obviously, and now it's like a comfort rewatch of like, oh, remember when? So it's more nostalgia than it is current work. But The Five People You Meet in Heaven is a book by Mitch Albom, who also wrote Tuesdays with Morrie. Great author. It's very much written in a progressive-ish Christian attitude of life and death and heaven. But I kind of love the story, just the fact that some pretty big name actors came together because they liked the book so much, and like Mitch Albom, they were like, we'll do a 2-part TV movie that's kind of like a Hallmark take on the book. But it's the story of Eddie, this amusement park technician or mechanic who has never left this great value brand Coney Island called Ruby Pier. And so he has this life, and at the very beginning we see that this ride is about to fail, someone's about to die, and he sacrifices himself to try and push her out of the way, dies, and he goes through 5 of these sequences of the 5 people you meet in heaven that help you come to terms with your own mortality, help you move on, and learn the lessons you maybe did not learn throughout your lifetime. It makes you think a little bit, but it's definitely kind of fun to jump between these sequences and who's who. Jeff Daniels is great in it. I love his part with it. Ellen Bernstein is really fantastic. What did you think of it, having never seen it before?
Well, my first jump scare was that I couldn't watch it in HD.
Oh yeah.
I had
Oh
to
yeah.
watch it in standard definition. It was box format in the standard
Oh
definition.
boy.
I was like, what the hell? What time period am I in right now? No, I liked it. It kind of, you're right. I think a Hallmark movie like is the right kind of genre to put this
Yeah.
in. Like it kind of felt like a church produced movie, like, the old school like The Mediator or some of those old school like church history films.
Yep.
Uh,
Yep.
just in kind of its caliber and quality. And there were a couple moments where I even wrote down notes and then had to erase them later. Like, okay, that actually makes sense. Like Jeff Bridges having blue skin. I'm like, is this racist? And then it was like,
Ugh.
oh no, he just drank silver iodide and that made him blue. I'm like, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah. I thought it was good. What I was going to ask you is like, what time in your life did this become a sacred text for you?
Well, my mission president doesn't listen to these podcasts, so we're fine. So here's the deal. 2012, I've been on my LDS mission for about 5 months at this point. And as such, there's a lot of harsh rules and strict
Yeah.
guidelines, things you can and cannot do. One of them being you cannot watch a movie that is not made and produced by the church that's specifically
Hmm.
about church history, Jesus, or whatever else. So, as a movie lover, I was dying here, and it was 5 months in. I was bored. I was in a weird place because I'd already been reading the scriptures so incredibly fast. I'd like blown through the Book of Mormon once already in
Hmm.
5 months. I was into the Bible, going through the New Testament, and just frustrated that no one could provide me answers to these things that people were asking me. And when I
Yeah.
asked my higher ups, they were like, ask God. I'm like, well, I have been. All right, knock it off. Anyways, so there was this missionary, and we know now
Yeah.
there's chemical imbalances and other things going on. So,
Especially when you're 19.
especially when you're 19. And he was feeling pretty sick, or so he said. I don't even care at this point, but he was sick.
Yeah.
So he was staying at someone's house who was a member, and they opened it up to missionaries. They were out of town. And he's like, hey, I can't go out. I'm like, look, I'll switch with your friend. Your friend can go with mine, and I'll go with you. And about an hour into it, we're sitting around just like bored. We can't read anymore. We've taken naps. And he's like, look, there's a DVD case right there. There's this movie that I remember as a kid, and I'm going to pop it in because it's spiritual enough. And I said, I will not touch the remote, but go ahead. Like a good Ashkenazi Jew that I am. My Jewishness was showing. My Chavish goy went over and put the DVD in, and thank heavens. And so 2012, sitting here 20 years old, I was finally given some peace for things that I had not fully grappled with, wrestled with. I was
Hmm.
like, oh, maybe we don't all go to Mormon heaven. And maybe it could be something a little bit different. And at least for me right then, it was a moment of kind of recontextualizing my world that I will honestly say helped Kickstarter. It was a cog in the kickstarting towards a different spirituality that's kind of outside the bounds of the religion we grew up in.
Hmm.
And so for me, this was kind of a fun movie of bringing together some bigger concepts in almost a storybook format because it was kind of hallmarky.
Yeah.
At the very end, we have Ruby giving her thesis statement of the entire movie. And she says, this is the story of a man named Eddie who lived and died and would one day himself share the secret of heaven. That each life affects the other and the other affects the next. And the world is full of stories, but the stories are all one. And it's this connectedness kind of narrative that takes you through the whole story of no man is an island, and everything you do does echo through eternity in the biggest and small ways, but it doesn't have to be seen as good or bad, like we see with Jeff Daniels' character early on The Blue Man. The kid was playing in the street that led to Jeff Daniels' heart attack and his passing, but that's okay. It doesn't mean it's like a bad thing. No one's coming after him with malice in heaven. It's more of understand that your life had consequences, learn from them, move on.
Which of these? So I'm gonna just call an audible. I'm gonna interview about your movie.
Oh boy, let's do it.
And I have not rehearsed these questions at all, but I'm just going to pull them off the cuff. Which of the
Yeah.
5 lessons hit you the most? Because the 5 people that he meets in heaven are essentially 5 people that are uniquely qualified to deliver to Eddie these specific lessons. And the lessons are: we're all connected, the value of sacrifice, anger is a poison, lost love is still love. And then the last one, I think, was just kind of the gift of a merciful death. I don't know.
Yeah.
She wasn't really clear about her lesson. But which of the 5 sequences I think was most important for you?
I would say at that time and for a
Yeah.
long time, it was the first one. It was the Blue Man. The idea of the lives are connected, everything's in action. Even the most insignificant things you do have a ripple effect. And at least for me, it helped me to just learn and to focus on mindfulness.
Mm-hmm.
When I got back to BYU, I started a club about random acts of kindness, which as silly as it was, I was like, I want to be in charge of a club. Let's just do
Oh, I
this
remember
thing.
that.
Yeah. And so for me and a lot of friends, it had kind of gotten me into a different way of being of if I'm at Costco and I see the old lady pushing her shopping cart, it got me to walk over and help you load up the back of your car and do this. And it was always a surprise of people of like, people don't do this anymore. And so it kind of felt good to have that mindset of we are all connected.
Mm-hmm.
I think now Eddie's wife with Marguerite and
Yeah.
about love transcending life and death at this point in my life definitely hit more this time than it has before.
Yeah.
What
Yeah,
about you?
that was a really touching scene because you essentially Eddie's he's a tragic figure, right?
Yeah.
He's this young kid with a lot of promise, and then he goes off to war and gets injured, and he does some heroic things at war, does some really villainous things in war. It was the Vietnam War. And then he comes back or he leaves the love of his life. He comes back to the love of his life and kind of lives a half life his entire life.
Yeah.
And at some point, his wife gets sick and dies, and leaves him kind of tragic even more for the rest of his life. But that sequence there at the end with his wife is the fourth person, his dead wife is the fourth person to kind of bring him through. That lost love is still love, and it just takes new forms. I thought that one was really a delicate and intimate kind of story because you've got all these different background people who are just a bunch of random figures all in love
Yeah.
in various stages of love. And I thought what was really poignant in the story was Eddie was like, "Why do you look like the first day that I married you?" And she's like, "Well, I thought this is the version of me that you love the most." He's like, "Yeah, but can I see you on the last day that you were alive?"
Oh,
And she's like, "Are you sure?" He's like, "Yeah, no, that's the one that I want." And then she, then we get a camera pan and it looks back at her and she's like this sickly version of herself. And like, you can really see that like, oh, Eddie loved this woman through thick and thin at, her most beautiful on the wedding day, but also at her most sick the day before she died. And it's just like,
yeah. Love is real. The idea, I think, at least for me, of being able to recollect or relearn or revisit your life in this way, it still
mhm,
is fantastical and idealistic. And I think questions of reincarnation or Carl Jung and the collective subconscious have come into my mind the last few years. So I don't like fixate on this having to be reality by any means.
yeah.
As a story, I think it is great to at least consider our own lives and being more reflective. What are the lessons? What are the through lines? What can we pick out of our own lives before we pass? Because I
Hmm.
think that's one of the big moments for me is having family members of mine who had similar tracks to Eddie of feeling stunted, feeling like they never did what they were supposed to do, which we'll see again in Tree of Life a little bit with Brad Pitt's character as the father
Yeah.
of having these regrets living with, throughout their life. And I think maybe it was a product of time or maybe their fathers kind of influenced them too.
Hmm.
But I love the idea of sitting down every once in a while and whether it be journaling or just writing it down, looking at your life, who's affected you and why. And I've done it a little bit in my journals of saying, if I died today, who would I say affected me and how have I
Hmm.
affected somebody else? I thought it was especially poignant this time.
I think what's really good about this story is in that mythic sense, it redirects you back to yourself. And because there's a certain way in which our lives, our personal lives, are sacred texts, and we can mine our own life and our own experience for this spiritual wisdom. And we don't necessarily need to go to these external sources, but that our lives themselves our own stories can be sacred texts. And that's kind of what Eddie, who saw himself as this tragic figure his entire life, is shown from these 5 different people is that no, dude, your life was special and beautiful and sacred in its own way, even though you lived a half life because you were angry and because you were sad and you had a father wound and you were physically broken. And I think that was a really good aspect of the story. One that I think I really gravitated to in this is something that I have certainly noticed over time is that like one aspect of wisdom, I think, is understanding the larger context and that everything has a larger context. There's no thing that doesn't contextualized by something larger than itself.
Yeah.
And that's really exemplified in Eddie's relationship with his dad. That story where, the anger is poison, where he had a really tumultuous relationship with his dad, which, we also see in the Tree of Life, which might just be a hallmark of that time of, of
Yeah.
American history.
Yeah.
And he, being a little kid, only has a certain window into his father's actions. And not that the actions are good. And he's like a wife beater and all that kind of stuff. He's abusive. He's an abusive father like that. Those aren't good things. But the anger that Eddie carries into his life and through, his own behaviors, like from that is a really narrow understanding of who his dad was.
Yeah.
And so in that whole sequence, you get the context of why his dad is the way that he was. And you really can understand like, oh, my dad was also a man who was a link in a chain, and he also was a broken figure. And, there are some really heartbreaking reasons why my father was an abusive guy. And that doesn't excuse his actions, but it puts him in context, and it allows Eddie to finally like extend some compassion to his dad and let go of the anger that he had that wasn't doing anything other than poisoning his own heart. But I think that's a really great lesson of always look for the larger context. The larger context will like be the pathway through your maze.
Yeah, especially when it comes to parents, there's almost a whole new level of adulthood when you can finally realize your parents are also just adults trying to figure it out and not authority
Yeah.
figures or like godlike. And you go, oh, wait, you also are vulnerable and have your own frailties and questions and problems, and you had your own life. It's that stupid chart that I hate seeing on social media, but also it kind of rings true of time spent with friends, time spent with family, time spent alone, is the maximum on everyone's chart.
Mm-hmm.
And it really takes some empathy and some understanding to go, oh, other people have their minutes of turning the car off and sitting there and thinking, what am I doing with my life? And when you can put it in the context of your parents or the monsters and people that are affecting you, it definitely opens your heart up to, like the story, a whole nother level of understanding, forgiving, and it's an antidote to the poison in some ways. It doesn't make someone faultless or blameless, but it does give yourself a little more space to understand where it came from.
Yeah. So that last sequence, the fifth person, who's the little girl that he had a hand in her death because he burned, So the story context is that Eddie is a prisoner of war in this Vietnamese camp. They distract the guards, are able to, get their escape, but then they get a hold of some flamethrowers and just torch this village out of retribution, which, on some level you understand after being tortured, like why you might want some retribution, but then Eddie sees a figure moving in this house that he set on fire, and it's this little girl, and the little girl died in that fire and then comes and gets him when it's his time to die, and she's his fifth person that he sees. What is the lesson that he's supposed to learn there? Because she's not really like, it's not in neon signs like the other 4 are, of like, this is the lesson that you're supposed to learn from me. She doesn't really like, at least I didn't get that. So what's your take on that last sequence?
It's interesting because I always saw it as the person you should expect to hate you the most can also still love you on the other side. The idea of, okay, this life is a testing ground, proving ground. It's also an opportunity to live it out in the physical. So I think now I have not more of an issue with it. I have more to chew on this time watching. Because
Mm-hmm.
there is a question of she calls him out as, you're the reason I died. You burned me. But now you must wash me in kind of a ceremonial way like her mother would and take away the scars for her. But really it's for him. It's what he's seeing. So
Mm-hmm.
he gets to make peace with what he's done and kind of gain his own forgiveness.
Hmm.
I honestly want to chew on it a little more because I'm like, how do I feel about this? But I think it's an opportunity for forgiveness, but I still felt it was more of a mirror than it truly was for the other person, which I think is kind of the point. But
Right. I thought it was good. I really liked using the stone from the river to wash off her burns. There's a lot of religious metaphor and imagery in that, not just from Christianity, but that's pretty far-reaching kind of imagery. I almost wonder if it would have hit harder if he was the one that had the burns on his body,
yeah.
and that his act of washing her was the thing that was washing him off.
Mm.
Just in terms of storytelling,
Yep. Yep.
if that might have hit a little bit harder and gotten the message across a little bit more. I thought it was a great little storytelling nod where, the way that he dies is there's this roller coaster and it breaks and starts falling, and there's this little girl underneath it. And he, for whatever reason, I don't know why a little girl would be there in the first place. Actually,
Yep.
now that I'm saying it, that's insane.
Yeah.
Anyways, but she's there and he runs and he tries to go push her out of the way. And through the entire story of the movie, Eddie's like, is she alive? Did I save her? And everyone that he meets is like, that's not for me to tell you. Like, you just hold on, which is just like, dude, you're bearing the lead. Let this guy off the hook. But then the little girl at the end, finally, his fifth person is like, yeah, no, you saved her. You pushed her out of the way. He's like, but I pulled her out of the way. He's like, and the little girl's like, no. That was me pulling you out of your body.
Yeah.
And it was like, oh, wow, that's a great little ending. That's actually really cute. And then does it go into a sequence where everyone's on a beach?
Everyone's at the pier.
In Afterlife? Yeah, everyone's at a pier.
Everyone's at a pier, yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, that was the Tree of Life, actually, where there's an afterlife. But where everyone's at a pier and she's there and all the people are there and everyone's kind of giving knowing nods at each other and stuff because they're all there in the afterlife, and it's beautiful. Yeah, no, it was a good movie. Yeah, the standard definition was like grains of sand in my eye.
Rough, yeah.
But I made it through.
I think my biggest takeaway outside of just the messages this time was definitely, this was written in the 90s, early 2000s by Mitch Albom. This is written by a white man who came from a time that shaped him. And now in 2025, it definitely looks dated and feels like a white man's story from the 2000s. Yeah, just the way in which everything's framed, the way in which, like you're saying, Eddie should have been burned and not her. It's him doing the story of an older white guy. I understand we live in America and that is majority and whatever, but I will say there's just some moments where I sat there and I was like, oh, this is a little wincy of we've moved beyond this. A little more empathy, a little more seeing characters that are not just ourselves, the white man on screen. So for everyone, you may not find everything as relatable. That's purposeful.
And also, I would say a little less didactic. Like, this is a movie that gives you the answer. It doesn't ask the question, it gives you the answer. And I would say, a hallmark, I would say, of really great storytelling is that it asks the question. It doesn't give you the answer. You have to find the answer. You have got to do the work to ask the question yourself. But yeah, this movie holds your hand until the end. And that is atypical for movies these days.
I think what I had done afterwards is when my friend and I finished this movie, we had our journals and it's all of 2 hours and some change. We were like, who are the 5 people you would meet in heaven? And we sat there and kind of wrote them down. And I had written down quotes as I was watching it that I just had kept. I always keep a book of quotes. As missionaries, we had to give a sermon at dinner every night that we had dinner with somebody.
Dude, I was so good at those. I
loved it so much and I want to do it again. And I'm like, I just can't pull this out with my fiance and be like, let me read you a quote from Nietzsche. But either way, I had these quotes written down and I would quote them and say, I heard a philosopher say, and no one would ask me the philosopher's name.
Yeah.
And so I would quote some of these things to people and I just felt like it was deep at the time, but my lessons had transcended the movie. And watching it again, I was like, oh yeah, it's better in memory and thinking about what I thought about each thing rather than watching it literally. And so perhaps for anyone who gives this a watch, Write down notes and thoughts you have, and the meditations will be much more powerful than the presentation. Where I think on Tree of Life, the presentation is equally stunning and causes
Yeah.
questions the whole time.
Yeah.
So just a note there, you can rent or buy it on Prime. It's all of $4 to buy. It's like in episodes, but yeah, all of $4 in Prime. Or
Yeah.
go find it at your local library. I know it exists. Let's talk Tree of Life.
let's let's get to the PhD level.
Let's do it.
Here's why the Tree of Life is on my list. Just a little background on the movie itself before we jump to my background on the movie. So this movie made by Terrence Malick. Terrence Malick he's an auteur. He's got a very, very distinctive style of making movies. From everything from dialogue to editing to camera work to cinematography, like he just has a very distinctive style. And Tree of Life is like you've just maxed out all the faders on Terrence Malickness. Also, I remember I remember seeing trailers for this movie like way back when I was like a teenager, and then hearing reviews about it, how like half the people in attendance at like at like film festivals, half the people in attendance like stood up and walked out, and then the other half of the people like applauded the movie when it was done. Obviously, that's what happens at film festivals. But this movie is polarizing, in the sense that it is not it doesn't tell its story in a typical linear narrative fashion, and so it is very in that sense it's kind of dreamlike. It's visionary. It is, I don't know, plays kind of like memory in some sense.
Yeah.
And so it's a very, I don't know, if you were to sit down and watch it, like maybe do it with a glass of wine. If you don't personally have the dedication to just like give your attention to something for 2.5 hours that kind of wanders and doesn't have a narrative structure that is predictable and flows like you would expect like an Avengers movie to flow, right? Like this movie is, when I say dreamlike, that is really, it's good context for what this movie feels like. It feels kind of dreamy. Would you agree?
I would agree, and I have so many questions for you. You just tell me if you're ready for
Okay.
questions yet.
So here, my personal background with this movie was, so I was at BYU. I was a student at BYU going through, all kinds of faith deconstruction stuff or whatever. And I was a student in the humanities. And the thing about being in the humanities at BYU is that the humanities it's essentially a degree in critical thinking. And so all the professors there know that they're arming their students with some pretty intense critical thinking skills, and like suspicion of authority and power. And they know that we're going to turn around and use that on our own community.
Yep.
And so I would say the Tree of Life was an arrow in their quiver, and them being my professors. And I watched this movie like 3 or 4 times over 4 or 5 different classes.
Wow.
Wait, reverse that. Like 5 or 6 times over 3 or 4 different classes, because it was clearly a sacred text for my professors, as they were, teaching us there. And it was like a lens through which they were helping us understand humanities and what it means to be a human. And so I've sat with this movie over and over and over again in my mid-20s and chewed on it, and wrote papers and stuff on it. And so it just over time worked its way into my soul, as I was, forced to really take kind of graduate level approach to a movie that reads like a dream and is visionary and is very honestly like scriptural in its nature. It kind of has a Christian background. Like, the movie begins with a little epithet. I don't think epithet's the right word. A little quote on screen, and it's a quote from, it's a verse from Job. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? And that's how the movie begins, is that Bible verse. And so you just know that you're kind of in for something mythic in scale. And then it kind of goes from there. And so you're kind of primed with, oh, this is going to be kind of a Job-like story of like suffering and joy. And yeah, then the movie kind of goes from there.
We're just gonna call out the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
For those watching it who may not be prepared or don't know or have not heard much about this movie,
Hmm.
it could be a little jarring when you begin to see the cosmos and dinosaurs and sharks and underwater protozoa and bacterium. For
That's the best
you,
part.
at least from for the beginning, for you the first time,
Yeah.
how did the trip through the cosmos in the first third of the movie that is not later revisited in the same way, how
Yeah.
did that impact you, and what was your take on the importance of that versus now? Has it changed at all? Is it still the same to you?
Oh, certainly it's changed. I mean, so the
Okay.
first time I watched this, I watched it on a laptop,
Yeah.
like,
Yep.
on a couch or something. And I think I watched it in parts because I couldn't watch through the entire thing in one time because it was too disjointed in my mind. I was expecting something like with the narrative structure that I'm used to.
Yeah.
Um, and I was doing it for homework as well. And so I knew like I had to watch the movie by this date. And so I knew that I could like chunk it. And like I don't like to chunk movies anymore. Like that is not my preference when it comes to movies anymore.
Yep.
But so I remember watching it in chunks, and you and I both we both come from Mormonism, and in the Mormon temple, part of the temple liturgy is a dramatic recreation of or a dramatic presentation of the creation of the universe.
Yeah.
And so on some level, this fit within my mind. Like it just fit in my mind.
Yep.
It was still weird, right? Because you start the movie where you get the one in the future, the son in the future.
Sean Penn.
Yeah. So you essentially start the movie with Sean Penn doing like a voiceover, who's the future version or the present day version, I guess, of this
Yeah.
character. And then we start getting some flashbacks of his life, in the past when he was a kid, about his mom and his dad. And then you kind of get some dreamy voiceover of the mom and then some dreamy voiceover of the dad. And then the movie goes way back to the beginning of the universe and then plays through the entire creation of the entire universe,
Yeah.
down through the creation of the sun to the creation of the earth to dinosaurs through like amoebas
Yeah.
up until dinosaurs. And then you like see this dinosaur interaction with this, predatory dinosaur with like a sick dinosaur on the ground. And then that's like all of 40 seconds. And then you move on to that. And then you move up into the future again, and then you rejoin the story of this family in like the 50s, in Waco, Texas. And then you occasionally make jumps back into the future with Sean Penn's character, who's the present day version of this oldest son who's like remembering his life. And so watching through the first time, I'm like, I don't know what is happening at any moment, because I don't understand what the narrative is. This is dreamy. This is memory like. But now I totally get it. I totally get what Terrence Malick was doing, right? Because just like I was saying with the 5 people you meet in heaven, you need to understand context, and context is the thing that that really drives, I don't know, your life and helps you make sense of it. And so what I think his name is Jack, what Jack is doing,
Jack, yeah.
Sean Penn Jack is doing is he's trying to make sense of his life. Because there's a lot of tragedy in it. One of his brothers dies, and his father was emotionally abusive, and his mother was kind of sat back and took it. And so he's trying to make sense of his life as an adult. And whether he is the one dreaming about the creation of the universe or Terrence Malick is the one showing the creation of the universe, and the creation itself is the background for his life, makes a lot of sense to me, because you start small with the tragedy that he's dealing with, and then you explode out into the shape of the entire cosmos, and then we rejoin the family. And to me, that is a really great like grounding for the very human stories that are told on this planet, that there's a depth and a beauty and an intimacy to our little human lives when played against the background of the cosmic creation.
So for everyone who may have gotten lost, the answer is yes. No, I'm just kidding. It's interesting because the first time I watched it, I was like, I should be on drugs to watch this. The next time I watched it, I had seen people on drugs, and I was like, you should not be on drugs to watch it because you're going to completely miss it. And so this third view, and this is my third time watching it, there was a soberness of, oh, At a certain point, I think Terrence Malick wants some of it to wash over you in a way, like standing on the beach, that the tide should roll over your feet and then go back out and you see more clearly what's below you. At least for me with this cosmos thing of it's grand, it's this universalness of an asteroid hit the earth and took out the dinosaurs and here we are and mammals and evolution. But all of that, it's not for each one of us, but it's part of our story that, like you're saying, is still internal family connection,
Yeah.
and they don't exist in two separate planes. It's all part of the same thing. We are of the earth, and therefore
Yeah.
this is part of our story.
Yeah. I think also the through line to, or not the through line, I'd say if there is structure, the structure of this movie is that we get in the beginning, Mrs. O'Brien, who's the mom,
Yeah.
Jessica Chastain, she gives us a voiceover in the beginning that kind of helps us understand the behaviors of characters over the movie.
Mhm.
And I'll just read that now. She says, "The nuns taught us that there are two ways through life, the way of nature and the way of grace. You have to choose which one you'll follow. Grace doesn't try to please itself, accepts being slighted, forgotten, disliked, accepts insults and injuries. Nature only wants to please itself, get others to please it too, likes to lord it over them, to have its own way. It finds reasons to be unhappy when all the world is shining around it, when love is smiling through all things. They taught us that no one who loves the way of grace ever comes to a bad end. I will be true to you, whatever comes." What a great, like, I just like, I get
Scripture.
chills. I get chills reading that. It is very scriptural. So as I was in school and we were watching this movie, these are the kind of the two things that we were focusing on, like the way of grace and the way of nature. If I could rewrite this, I wouldn't call it the way of nature. I would call it like the way of the world.
Yeah.
Because it's so clear that the way of nature itself is actually very grace filled and is full of love. And so that would be my one edit to the movie, would be rewriting it, rewriting that one line. But it kind of posits these two ways of being alive in the world, which is the way of grace and the way of nature. And the way of grace is to kind of just like accept being slighted and forgotten, and is full of love and kind of, I wouldn't say like, I mean, it's meek, it's Christian, it's very, in the very like monkish kind of way of things, not like this like pathetic, that would be kind of the way of the world of looking at it, would be, oh, they're weak, they're pathetic, they don't stand up for themselves kind of stuff. But there's a more wise and spiritual way of seeing that behavior as being like, no, they're actually really grounded in themselves, they're grounded in love. They know that other people's behavior aren't necessarily about them, and so they can accept other people's behavior even if it's shitty.
Yeah.
Versus the way of nature, which these two ways of living are exemplified by the two different parents. And so Mrs. O'Brien, Jessica Chastain's character, exemplifies the way of grace, and then Brad Pitt's character, Mr. O'Brien, exemplifies the way of nature.
Yeah.
And throughout the movie, he's a toxic masculine presence throughout the film, who has moments of breaking through, of understanding that he's a problem. Yeah. But throughout the film, like, you kind of get the most beautiful moments of the film are all from like Jessica Chastain's perspective of, walking through the streets. It's very dreamy. Oh, a butterfly comes around and you're like showing your kids the sunlight in the trees, and like, it's beautiful. And then you kind of get Brad Pitt's character coming in, and he's a problem everywhere he goes. He's demeaning, he's demanding. What else? Demeaning, demanding. He's obsessed with ownership, money, unattainable perfection. And he cannot tolerate his authority being challenged. And he's a father to three boys who challenge his authority all the time. And it's just like, it's uncomfortable to watch, because it is such a disruption of the natural grace of life. And so this whole movie is about these two ways of being in the world. And it doesn't necessarily give you an answer either, because, in that initial voiceover, she says, no one who ever, the nuns told us that no one who loves the way of grace ever comes to a bad end. And then the sequence immediately following that is her finding out that her son has died. And so it's challenging that notion that like everyone who loves the way of grace, no one comes to a bad end. And then you have to like wrestle with it. And so this movie is like, it's about wrestling with these two ways of being in the world. And it doesn't necessarily give you a clean answer.
That was going to be my question. Yeah. Do you think Terrence Malick really delivers a here's the right or wrong?
I mean, okay, yeah, he does.
Oh, well,
It's the way of grace.
the way of grace is the right way.
It is the way of grace is the right way. And it's not that like you never come to a bad end. It's not that nothing bad will ever happen to you. It's that you'll be able to handle and accept with grace the things that do happen versus the way of nature, Brad Pitt's character, everything that happens is a problem for him. And he just like, he breaks near the end of the film because he just like, gets fired. He like his patents, whatever, he loses money. And at every moment, he makes his problems everyone else's problems.
I will say, watching this and knowing why he and Angelina got divorced and the stories now, it is rougher to watch. Being like, oh, he wasn't just like drawing on some things he's seen as character. This is a little bit Brad Pitt, and it's kind of rough.
Yeah.
I know growing up in hierarchical Christian patriarchy religion, there's always the question of father and son.
Mm-hmm.
But like you just mentioned for a second ago, sons challenge their father's authority constantly and are maybe
Mm-hmm.
not usurping, but they're whether you're talking about Oedipus or you're talking about old stories in Grecian times or whatever else, we have all these stories of the father-son relationship.
Or Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader.
Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader.
Yeah.
Where do you think the movie nets out at the end? Because, like you're saying, that bit with Brad Pitt when he loses his job, that to me is one of my favorite poetic moments. The things that he's saying
Mm-hmm.
of, that's cheapening it, but I lost the plot. I was not as good as I should have been. I wasn't always there. I was chasing something wrong. I
Yeah.
never missed a day at work, and now they're giving me either get fired or the worst job that no one wants, and that's what I've earned. I've
Yeah.
done it wrong. But how do you think that father-son dynamic plays out at the conclusion of the movie?
Yeah. That's a good question. I think on one level, in order to become a person, you have to push back against the things that you're identified with.
Yeah,
Otherwise you're gonna live a life of codependent identification, and you're not going to really be able to differentiate your own. You're not going to have a consolidated ego self. Sorry, I said a lot of like Jungian therapy adjacent words, but which is to say that kids push against their parents so that kids can learn who they are.
yeah,
That's just the truth of it. And so even if you're a perfect parent, your kids are going to push against it because they need to discover their own strength. And so I think that a lot of the story was about the kind of the growth of this character Jack and his fall from innocence, his fall from grace, and then him having to like deal with the fact that he's a human being. And as he's I'd say if the movie lost the plot at all, it's that we don't really know what adult Jack is grappling with. It's kind of an effusive like midlife crisis thing that he's going through. And from what I've heard, Sean Penn is a little disgruntled about this movie because there is probably an entire movie's worth of material of just his the adult Jack story going on that never made it to the film. So
yeah.
there's a lot left on the cutting room floor that we just didn't get. But that being said, Jack not just pushes against his father, but also sees his own father's hypocrisy. There's a whole thing where he's like, you tell us not to put our elbows on the table, but you do. You tell us not to lie, but you do.
Yeah.
And you tell us not to get angry, but like you do. And that's like developmentally appropriate behavior of children to be able to they start to see through the stories that their parents are telling them. But if you're an emotionally immature parent, those things can be real threats to your own identity.
Yeah.
And Brad Pitt's character is an emotionally immature parent in a huge way. And so I think in the end, not in the end, but in the middle, Jack's character has kind of a reconciling moment with his dad. And he's like, I'm more you than I am her. There's a lot of sadness in that where he's like, I wish that I wasn't. I wish I was
Yeah.
more like her. I wish that I was more, the way of grace, but I'm more like you. And he kind of has to reconcile with that. And I think at the end, you get some bit where he's on the phone with his dad and he's like, yeah, I shouldn't have said what I said, whatever. I think about him all the time. And so there's something going on with his dad where he's trying to reconcile. But, at the end, you kind of get this dreamy afterlife sequence where they're like on the salt flats in Utah and there's water
Yeah.
washing around them, or they're going through Goblin Valley in Utah. Utah is the afterlife. Utah's heaven. That's what you really
That's
got
the
to take away from this
takeaway right
movie.
here.
But everyone's there. His little brother's there and his little brother body. All
Yeah.
of his family is there in their youth, and he gets to reconcile with each one of them in the form of hugs and like intentional eye contact. And I think that's really the takeaway, is that you want to live through life with the way of grace, because it'll bring you peace, it'll bring you love. And the way of nature will bring you suffering, and it'll bring suffering to other people as well. But the end of all things, like, you can reconcile. I mean, these things are going to be alive in both of us, right? Like Jack
Yeah.
is a character that represents each one of us, and that his mom is the way of grace, his dad is the way of nature, meaning that he has both the way of nature and the way of grace inside of him, and he's wrestling between those two. And for us as individuals who watch this movie and also live life, we have the way of grace and the way of nature on the inside of us. We're never going to have just one. We have got this ego structure that does feel slighted and does like want to like lord our possessions over other people and want to build empires and stuff. But we also have access to like our soul and our spirit that wants to just delight in the sunlight and the trees, and catching little frogs and teaching little kids how to walk. Like, what beauty is that? And so we have both of these natures inside of us, and it's up to us to learn how to reconcile them throughout our lives.
Yeah, I hate to say that the film leans towards that binary because you're like, oh, the gray area and the rest of it. And like you're saying, there's a blend of both in us. But you are right in saying if you don't have the grace, it definitely makes it clear that you're a little more lost. That the ending of the film and the metaphysical, metaphorical reunion that he has with his family is only possible because he holds space for both. I was
Mm-hmm.
deeply affected by these traumatic moments and the choices of others and how they decided to act towards me and how that influenced me. But at the same time, I love these people, and this is part of my experience and our experience, and having grace for both of those. I don't want to say it's not like people don't do it, but I think it's very difficult. I mean, I think sometimes
Yeah.
with therapy speak and otherwise, we talk about like, oh no, 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 like they can't have space in my life. I won't let them affect me that way, and that is definitely true for the most part. But if you're not able to have that graceful compassion and holding both spaces and being at peace with yourself, you're forever affected by those that affect you and held down by it. Where I think it's nice, like you're saying, that whole entire Utah sequence of going through the slot canyons and, like you said, Goblin Valley and out to the desert, the Utah
Mm-hmm.
salt flats. It's all wide and huge and expansive and created by God, or the real carved by nature. But what's important are the other human beings around him. And that to me was my moment of like, oh, in the grand expanse of everything, it's always what's right around you and who you are
Yeah.
interacting with in this life.
I mean, if I could do, just a take right now, like just in terms of like the storytelling language, um, like I think the way of grace in the movie is exemplified by nature,
Yeah.
which is really, that's why I would have changed the way that they edited this, right? Or at least
Yeah.
the way that they wrote it. Because, I would say the creation of the universe, that's a grace. None of us
Yeah.
asked for it. It just happened. And
Yeah.
we just get to be here and benefit from a lot of it, from all of it. And like, you don't have to pay for sunshine. Sunshine
No.
just falls on you, and it just is a grace. And so I'd say in the language of the movie, nature itself is exemplifies grace, and buildings, and because like even the father, the dad, he's an engineer, and so he's got a lot of patents for mechanical stuff. And so like buildings and like cars and planes or whatever are exemplify the way of nature. And adult Jack, he's stuck in a world full of skyscrapers.
Yeah.
Like all, when you see Sean Penn, he's in buildings, he's in infrastructure, he's not outside, he's not in nature at all. He's stuck in a world of infrastructure and like development. And so to me, in the storytelling language, that's like, oh, he's stuck in the way of nature. But then when he goes through the sequence of like the canyons, Goblin Valley, the salt flats, and it's wide and expansive, it's like, oh, the way of nature exists within the context of the way of grace.
Yeah.
That the way of grace is actually the way of everything. Everything operates. The nature itself the cosmos itself operates by the way of nature, and it's just humans who have developed this way counter to it, the way of the world, I'd say, um, within the context, within this larger context. And so if you can begin to understand that, you can disengage from that and relax back into your natural nature, which is the way of grace. And I'd say that that's kind of what the storytelling language helps us understand, because you're right. If you hold up these two ways of living as two binaries,
Yeah.
you're going to be pulled from one end to the other. And there's a certain aspect of human consciousness that thrives in the binary, that wants things to be either black or white, and doesn't want things to be nuanced and colorful. They want it to just be like, this is either wrong or it is right. And they want the
Yeah.
world to be like, to be oriented around that. You can even see that with Mr. O'Brien, Brad Pitt's character, where he's like, he's got a lot of rules of like, you got to address me as sir. Like, don't have your elbows on the table. You got to like,
Call me father, not dad.
call me father, not dad. All these things is like, as if they're cosmically important, and they're not cosmically important. And so the only, like, the way through is not to jump to the other end of the spectrum, because that still exists in a binary.
Yeah.
The way is to get big enough so that you can include both, and have both of them operate inside of you. And then that's the only way you can get bigger and get more peace and less suffering.
It's interesting hearing Jessica Chastain as Mother and Grace and Brad Pitt as Father and Way of the World, and their quotes throughout the movie, because I think a lot of them are so relatable for a lot of people, or things that we hear all around us. I mean, a lot of it I really resonated with from people in my own family and outside, of Brad Pitt saying, "Your mother's naive. It takes a fierce ambition to get ahead. This bootstrapping ass capitalism that we just can't seem to escape." Or at one point, he turns to his son. He's like, "Don't do what I did. I wanted to be a great musician." Like, the longing and all these different things combining and placing pressure on a young impressionable soul that will affect him through his own life. And after seeing him in these big old buildings and elevators, like you're saying, the spaciousness is really more lonesome than it feels grand when we see older Jack. And I guess that brings me to one more thing that I just cannot stop thinking about, is this, in my mind, is the best visual representation of memory in any movie. I think Arrival does good in its parts, but this, to me, while watching it this time through, I just thought, oh shit, this is what memory feels like. It's chopped up, it's bits. There's not always or often dialogue. It's memory, it's feeling, it's emotion, and I think he does such a good job at it. I mean, how did you feel about how he presents the story in memory? What is he trying to say about memory?
Yeah, I don't know. It's very nostalgic, right? Like, it makes you want to go back and be a kid and running through the streets. Although some of it is really scary, like when they're running through the clouds of the gas, DDT.
Oh,
Can you believe that?
you know,
Oh my
running through
gosh.
clouds of DDT. Yeah.
Anyways, so yeah, the movie is very nostalgic. It makes you want to like go back and be a kid again. But it also, I feel like, in its nostalgia, wakes up the kid in you here now, because Terrence Malick, the way that he does the cinematography, it's, like I said, dreamlike, it's memory-like. It makes you want to look at the world in that way. But then you're right, his editing, it's choppy. There's a lot of jump cuts, a lot of match cuts that that just like line up, and you don't even notice that they're happening unless you're paying attention to it. And I think that is very memory-like. So yeah, I think you're right that this is a phenomenal depiction of memory. But then, you also, an aspect of memory is, we in the present, anytime we go back and remember something, we're colonizing our own memory with our present biases. And so, you got to ask the question, if the whole point of this movie was, this is kind of a remembrance of adult Jack, like, what are the biases that adult Jack is carrying into his memories that are changing the story as it's being told. And so it does, feel very dreamlike and memory-like, trance-like, and especially almost prayer-like, because a lot of the voiceovers feel like we're getting a window into each character's inner dialogue, inner monologue, their own prayer, like, to God. or the divine or whatever. And there's an intimacy to the movies and the scenes that like you just don't really get in a lot of movies.
Yeah. One of my other movies that's on the list, The Fountain. Have you watched it yet? I know I've talked
I
about it for
haven't.
years. It's going to, again, be a step down from this. It's going to be
Mhm.
quite a bit different, but I think in similar ways, there's moments where the characters whisper, and so you have to really lean in. And this movie had so many of these moments. I mean, especially looking through the cosmos and Jessica Chastain as graceful mother saying,
Mhm.
light of my life, I search for you. And it just hits you where you're like, wait, this is not just a regular movie, like this is it,
Yeah.
it's on a screen, it had a budget, people were paid, actors, there was an editing process, but at the same time, the way in which it really causes you to lean forward if you're open to it, it is scriptural, and I can see why it is a sacred text for you.
Yeah. So yeah, I'd say this is a great beginning to our sacred text series.
Good way to
we
kick it off.
I'd
Good
say
way to kick
I'd
it
say
off.
the rest of my movies probably aren't as graduate level as this one is.
And you know what?
Yeah,
For
probably not.
the best.
Yeah, for
I
the best.
think I think it's a good way to start because we'll have things to go deeper otherwise, but again, it's going to be our interpretations, our nostalgia, and how we've
Yeah.
interpreted it with our own lives that'll be the more important part. And I
Yeah.
hope for everybody, not that anyone's just watching movies to watch movies, but the examine life is one that causes more meaning to pop out and more things to be important. I was reading a quote the other day that was like, people who have too many critiques of movies just haven't seen enough movies. And sometimes that's what it is. It's like, if you have too many critiques, if you're just like struggling with, this movie is dumb, boring, whatever, keep watching, keep watching, expand your breadth. Really watch things that are kind of outside your scope. And I hope with this, some of these movies are probably things that people have seen a poster for or never heard of, and they may
Mhm.
pass by. But this is a great opportunity to just expand what you're watching with what we like watching, and in
Yeah.
turn, hopefully, we'll both, the two of us, expand our horizons. There's enough of, Avatar: The Last Airbender I have put off for 20 years.
You haven't seen
I've
it?
never seen it.
Oh
Never.
my
It was
gosh,
on
Tristan.
TV, and I was like, it's what these kids watch. I'm not watching it, and I know it's good because I've seen clips, and I'm like,
Dude.
damn, it's good.
Oh, I can't wait to talk about those with you. And
Yeah.
even like I think Steven Universe was on my list. And
Yep.
dude, cartoons, man. Like I think half of my sacred texts are animated. Like I really there's just something magical about those things.
I'm going to tell you my personal vendetta I'm doing this year.
Mm-hmm.
I will never refer to another American cartoon as a cartoon.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to call them animation. And
Yeah.
it's called anime in Japan. We're just going to talk about it as animation because it's an animated
Yeah.
drama, an animated adventure series. It's animation because I think sometimes we just write it off too much. And having watched enough anime with work now, I go, oh, okay, yeah, maybe writing something off because it's drawn with, pencil, paper, pen, or otherwise is stupid. Duh. But I think there's still too many people that'll be like, what's so deep about Avatar?
I
What's so
know.
deep about The
Well,
Land Before Time? Okay, well,
yeah, because anytime I tell people Princess Mononoke and like Studio Ghibli, they're like, "Oh, it's like anime." I'm like, "Don't say that like it's a disparaging thing.
yeah,
It's a
yeah.
medium to tell a story. Like, grow the fuck up."
Much like subtitles in this country, it's time for this country and other Western nations to get on board with anime is for everyone and it's for adults. And in
Yeah.
Japan, there is no difference there. Well, let's wrap it up there for today. Thank you for listening to our first in our Sacred Text series. We're looking to do about one a month, and we're going to hope to do it on the third week of the month. So, third week of the month will be our Sacred Text. I will link the movies we're going to discuss the week before in case you want to watch it going into the episode. So, that will be available for you then. And until next week, we hope all of you continue to watch good and meaningful movies and TV.